Hey everybody, Ragnarok here. Going to go over a game that I was able to successfully defeat a ChessMaster, and that's going to be a rating of about at least 2200 USCF. This was a 10-minute game time control, so what I'd like to do in the future obviously is get better at longer time classical, maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours time control. So blunders can absolutely happen to anybody, but it's kind of cool to see my game as it progresses. So I'm going to go over this game. I was playing as black against my opponent. He played e4, c5, and then c3. So this is known as the Alapin, and it's really essentially trying to get full control over d4 and e5 by trying to support it with c3. Now, the main drawback here, which I tried to take advantage of in this game, was that this c3 pawn, if I don't accept his d4 pawn push, it's kind of limiting the knight from going over to the c3 square. So I try to keep that in mind. And the other thing I want to do is, when I'm playing the Sicilian, essentially what you want to do is push d5 at some point. If you can push d5, it's really helpful because it's going to help you to open up the center. Otherwise, you're going to be cramped because in most games, if they're just playing normal, I'll usually play d6 to try to control this e5 square. And as you notice, I'm not really having control of d5 just yet. However, in the Alapin, after c3, I'm able to successfully play d5 right away. I could also play f6. That's another line putting pressure on e4. Usually you'll want to consider this anytime an opponent plays c3 in the Sicilian, which sometimes they may do at a different point. But in this variation, I decided to go with d5 right away, almost forcing him to take, and then me taking back with the queen on d5. Yes, it's true the queen is in the center, which goes against any principle you'll see on ragchess.com. The knights and bishops, of course, not yet developed, but then again, neither has he developed. And the key reason why d5 is not great for the queen is because the knight would attack it with c3. However, in this variation, c3 is blocking the knight from its most natural square, so it can't put any pressure on the queen right away. So the normal response is going to be d4 to try to open up and put an attack on the c5 pawn. My opponent's hoping that I'll take here, he can take back, have an isolated queen pawn, but eventually he's going to be able to develop his knight with tempo on my queen. So that's why I don't want to accept just yet. So I just tried to keep the pressure. You don't always have to take a pawn just because your opponent's trying to get you to. Try to think about why they're doing it and what they're trying to achieve. And in this case, they want to be able to move that c3 pawn to a central square and develop their knight. So I bring my knight out to c6, putting more pressure on this pawn. He develops to defend the pawn, and then I decide to pin. So you'll notice that I've developed all three of my queen side pieces. So I'm really at least, I would say, well, the pawn would have to move knight and bishop 3 moves, and then the actual move of castling 4 moves away, essentially, from castling. However, I think it's okay in this scenario because I'm putting a lot of pressure on the center, and I don't have an immediate threat on my queen, or even my king. I mean, the bishop could come out, but then, that's not a huge threat right now. So I think this is probably the first inaccuracy, you could say, of the game, because I think the best move here, really, almost anytime you're pinned, you want to try to block the pin in some way. I think bishop to e2 is probably the best course of action to go with. Because then, if I take, he takes back. Now he's got pressure on my queen. Sure, he doesn't have the c3 knight attacking my queen, but he found another way to do it. So I think that's probably the best way to continue. However, in this variation, my opponent went with bishop to e3, which is nice. I mean, it puts another attacker on this pawn, so I have to do something to defend it. And that's why I decide to first take his knight, because I see that I'm going to open up his king. And if you think about where his king is going to castle, if he goes to the queen side, I mean, he has this open gap here that I could potentially, maybe even take this pawn if my queen is still on d5. So he really doesn't want to castle this way, and he's let me know that by going with c3. And if I can, even if he goes with this, the doubled up pawns and the exposed semi-open g-file is really going to be an issue for him down the line. So that's why I decided to take right away. And instead of taking back with queen, because he wants to keep pressure, I think, on the center, he takes back with pawn, which I see as a weakness that I'll try to exploit later. So next I decide to consolidate the center a little bit. He takes back with pawn, and it's true he's got this square. However, my next move of e6 allows my bishop to come out and pin the knight if it does decide to come out. So it does. Naturally, that's the square that it wants to go to. I decide first I'm going to move my queen over to a5. This is pinning the knight, and I'm also getting ready to bring my bishop out to b4 to be able to put a double attack on this piece. Because if he just lets me do it, the threat here is that I would take back, and take this pawn with an attack on the rook, as well as an attack depending on which way he blocks. So this would not be good for him, of course, but he also wouldn't make those other two moves. So he moves out to b3, helping to defend the knight, but also getting an eye on the b7 pawn. Now this is where I come out because he cannot take the bishop, but I decide to pin this knight even further and put more pressure on here, with ideas of bringing my knight out to f6 and then d5 to just put more pressure on the knight as well as the bishop. So rook c1 to help defend the knight, but he still hasn't done anything to defend the actual pin itself on the king. And he's still a couple moves away. He's going to have to move his bishop out somewhere and then be able to castle away. And what's he really castling into? I mean, my queen is still active. It can come over to g5 at any time with a nice check. Of course, not any time with the bishop here, but that's the idea to keep in mind. And this pawn is very weak at this time too. So I bring my knight out. Now I bring it here. I think the main reason is because I'm eyeing up the d5 square, but I also don't want to take away the option of going to f5, putting pressure on the bishop, as well as, let's say he does castle, and I get my queen here. Having my knight here followed by over to h4 is going to threaten checkmate ideas if his bishop develops this way. So that's kind of the thought I'm having in the back of my head. So I come out to here. There's no real difference. I mean, I do put more defense on my c6 knight, which could eventually be possibly taken by either the rook. Maybe the bishop can eventually come here and put pressure on the knight. So just helping defend my knight. A3, just to try to force me to make a decision with my bishop, which I do by taking the knight. There's really no other place I can go. Moving back here just kind of either drops a pawn, or really there's not too much I can do over at this point. So the reason I came to bishop to b4 was to take the knight, so I'm going to go ahead and take the knight, which I do with check. And I think the best answer here for him is probably either queen takes, maybe pawn takes, try to unite this isolated pawn. But he takes with the rook, which I think is a mistake. The most obvious course, which I could do, is to bring my knight out here. The rook is pinned. I might even win that piece right away. But that's a little dangerous, so I decide I'm going to start to castle first because his bishop could potentially come out here and pin my piece, and I really didn't want to worry about that right now. So he comes out to c4. I think the main idea is to defend me from going to d5 because, well, again, I guess he wants to block me from attacking the rook, which I probably could have done last move. But really, this bishop and queen, they don't have an easy eye on the f7 pawn because I've played d6. D6 is a nice defensive move, helps block the d pawn from going to d5, and just kind of like, I guess he's protecting his queen, but if I can move my queen away, I've got a nice pin with my knight. So I've got some good ideas going on here at this point. So I decided to go to the other square, which I originally had set up, being the f5 square, put pressure on the bishop. You know, he's got the bishop pair, so generally that's going to give him an advantage. I probably don't want to take right away because he'll undouble his pawns, but I try to use my two knights because it's a little bit cramped on this board, so that seems a little bit better in this scenario. But if things open up, his bishop pair will definitely kill me in the long run, so I've got to do something quick. So I put pressure on his bishop. He knows I'm not going to take, so he just castles right away. And I decide to try to work my way in onto the king's side. So first I take this pawn. This pawn was hanging because he didn't really have time to defend it because of all the pins and pressure that I decided to keep on building up. So he takes back with bishop. Not too much else he could do. I take back with knight. Now I've got an idea of going to eventually going to e2 if I can just get rid of this bishop, because that would put pressure, or that would pin the king to the rook. So that's an idea I want to keep in the back of my mind. He takes on b7. Now with the bishop gone, I decide to check him and move his king away, knowing that if his rook comes over here, I've got some checkmate ideas if I can get my my knight over to f2 because the queen is blocking the other two squares. So my rook moves over to b8 to be able to kind of force him away. I could potentially take this if he takes. I mean, this is kind of really bad for him because my rook can take the f-pawn, followed by potential checkmate ideas, and even pressure on this bishop once my queen is on the h-file. So that's what could happen if he moved there. He decides to go over here, which makes the most sense. He needs to keep an eye on this pawn and try to block any potential check ideas. Not only that, but if he can get his rook here and his queen here, he's got a semi-open file on my g7 pawn, which would result in checkmate if I'm not careful. But then again, like, my knight is doing more than his bishop at this point. So I decided to move my f-rook over to d8, just defending my knight, because I'm not sure exactly where he wants to go just yet. Maybe he'll maneuver here, like I mentioned earlier, to try to get checkmate on this square. But, you know, my opponent could also block that with rook to g1, despite putting a little limitation on where his king can move to. So he does move there right away. And I decide I've got some potential x-ray attacks here, two attackers on here. If I can remove this pawn, I can possibly move this knight out of the way and grab this rook, because it is defending the rook. So just kind of like an x-ray attack, keeping my eye on the rook to see what happens. And then he goes b4. So take a second to find the tactic here. I think it's a pretty nice one, and let me know if you see it. Alright, so like I just mentioned, he did remove the defender, which is what I was going to do anyway next. Yes, he does have these two pawns against my one, and he's trying to force them down down the board, but unfortunately the move I think he missed was knight to e2. Putting a pin on both, or a fork on both rooks at the same time, and then if he does take here, his rook is now hanging, allowing me to go up with two nicely developed rooks. I mean, I've got an open file controlled already here. His king's tucked away in the corner, mate ideas are coming, and I can start to pick up the a pawn in this scenario. So that's not how it played out. He actually just moved his bishop back to d3. I think the main reason was he was going for some sort of checkmate idea, but I do have squares that I can retreat to. So I decided to just take the rook. You know, even a ChessMaster can give away material. Just try to seize it whenever you can. Don't try to overthink things. Sometimes you think like, oh, this guy's a ChessMaster for a reason. Maybe he's got some crazy plan if I take his rook. Try to think things out, but also just understand that everybody's a human and can make mistakes. So I take his rook, he takes with check, and then I move away. And he actually resigned at this point. I think I had about a minute of time left, and he probably had like 4 minutes or so. But you know, it's not really a great scenario for him. I've got check coming with this pawn, so he has to take a move. I mean, if he goes here, there's really nothing that he can do. He still has to defend this pawn. It's not really an easy way to do it. You know, maybe he comes back here. It's really just much easier for me to really continue. I could potentially move this way, open file on this. It's a lot of really good ideas. Maybe he goes here and just kind of double up my pieces, maybe even triple them up. I even have an idea of a fork here once this bishop moves. So really, I think a good game for me. The Alapin is an interesting opening. It's very strong. I would say try not to alleviate the pressure in the center too much if you're playing as black, because that's really what white wants. The white would get that nice center if we go back. Let's say, even if I played, say I played something different. You know, white's going to ultimately hope to get this center here, ultimately controlling all 4 of these squares. So hopefully you guys learned something about this game. Hopefully, you know, I do well in my upcoming tournaments that I have. They're going to be longer time controls, so wish me luck, and let me know what you guys think about this video. Thanks, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.